Well, it's my pleasure now to introduce to our extended audience who are watching the Alumni College on live stream our first speaker of the program, Ted Blaine. Ted is a 1974 graduate of Washington and Lee, now working at Woodbury Forest Academy. Ted is a novelist of some repute. He's published 2 mysteries, Passion Play in 1990 and Love Cools in 1992. Ted is also a short story writer, and he's going to introduce the subject of detective fiction, mystery fiction, from the perspective of one who creates them. So, Ted?
Thank you, Rob.
I look forward to your remarks.
First thing I'm going to do is move this. I know that pedagogically this is the wrong thing to do. I'm putting a barrier between myself and the students, but I don't want to do that. There's no psychological barrier. Believe me, we're all one. We're all bonding here. But I find the sight lines easier from this perspective. I think I can embrace everybody more easily if I'm a little bit farther back. So I may break the fourth wall and walk out among you. I don't know. I'll just see how the Spirit moves me as we get into this. The greatest thing on my mind, the greatest anxiety I had about going first was what I was going to wear for this presentation. And then I realized that that's the advantage of going first, that there's no frame of reference except for maybe those people who've been to 30, 40, 50, or 166 of these. But I decided to go with my W&L colors. I've got my blue and my white, my W&L seersucker, so this is all very deliberately chosen for the setting. I'd also like to say that one possible problem with going first is that I steal some thunder or say something contradictory to what the other presenters are going to say. So let me just invite Edward and Fred and Taylor and Hardin and anybody else, and in fact, every participant in this room to not be shy about questioning or challenging or asking for clarification on anything that comes out of my mouth. Maybe not at the time it happens. You might make a note and then bring it up later. But I really think it would be healthy for us to have some good, civil, academic disagreement or conversation without being disagreeable. I think that's possible, and I think that it's probably good for the group to hear people question exactly what another has claimed. You can see from your outline that I'm starting with 3 big questions, and you can also see from the outline that they become more and more subjective as we go along. Question number 1, what is a mystery? What do we mean when we're talking about crime fiction? Question number 2, what is it that distinguishes crime fiction from other works of fiction? Question number 3, and I think this is the reason I'm here, why don't more people write novels, and why don't more people write mystery novels? By the time we get to question number 3, you're just going to be hearing my experience. It's just going to get more and more and more about me. So I'm going to really enjoy this. I hope we all have some fun this morning as we think about this. I'm going to be a very strict constructionist about the mystery genre. When we're talking about mysteries, this morning anyway, I'm going to be talking about the whodunit. When I'm talking about a mystery, I'm talking about novels in which the protagonist is attempting to discover the perpetrator of a crime. The perpetrator is unknown through most of the novel, and we don't find out until close to the end who the criminal is. That means that I'm not going to be talking too much about thrillers. Thrillers are works in which the protagonist is in danger. There's some kind of threat to the protagonist, and the protagonist has got to escape. That can be a virus, It can be a dinosaur. It can be a monster. It can be an ex-lover who's got some sort of obsession. The threat can be almost anything, but the threat is to the protagonist. We're not trying so much to find out who did it as we're trying to find out how this protagonist is going to get away. The boundaries, of course, are really porous. Claire McIntosh is a fairly new British writer who writes thrillers. Her first novel, I Let You Go, is really devious and really interesting. I'm talking about this as a thriller, even though I said I was not going to talk about thrillers. The nice thing about being an English major is that you dwell in the land of paradox, and you feel free to contradict yourself at any time, day or night. I'm just trying to give you some idea of what I'm not going to be talking about. I'm not going to be talking about Michael Crichton and his Andromeda Strain or Jurassic Park. Stephen King loves to use clowns as some kind of manifestation of evil. Those are all fun to read, but we're not going to be talking about that. I'm also drawing a really fine line here. I'm not going to be talking that much about novels of suspense. And when I mean suspense, I'm being really, really narrow in this definition. When I'm talking about suspense, I'm talking about works in which we know already who the criminal is. We aren't trying to discover that. We know, we readers know who the criminal is. The protagonist may or may not know, but we know. And the suspense involves how this protagonist is going to defeat this adversary, who's going to prevail, what's going to happen. There's a lot of fun with suspense, but I'm going to be talking mainly about whodunits. I suspect that everybody in here knows Thomas Harris's Silence of the Lambs. If you haven't read the book, which is terrific, then you've probably seen the Jonathan Demme movie. Silence of the Lambs starts off as a mystery. Clarice Starling, the FBI agent, is trying to determine the identity of a serial killer they're calling Buffalo Bill. This is a man who's kidnapping women and for some odd reason is flaying them and doing all sorts of disturbing things. She's trying to find that out. Part of the way through the book, we discover the identity of Buffalo Bill. So then it becomes a novel of suspense. Is the FBI going to be able to catch up with him before he claims another victim? How is that cat and mouse game going to work? And then finally at the end, when Clarice Starling wanders into the lair of Buffalo Bill, and it's dark. She can't see anything, but he's got his night vision goggles on. Then it becomes a thriller. The protagonist is in danger, and we need to see how she might possibly escape this crafty, devious, evil, sick person. So I'm going to be talking about books in which the protagonist is trying to solve a puzzle or follow a set of clues to determine the identity of a perpetrator. We got 5 subgenres. There are zillions of subgenres. I'm choosing the big 5 as I would consider them. First one, police procedural. Ed McBain's 87th Precinct novels, I think, are among the best of those. Ed McBain is, of course, the pseudonym of Evan Hunter, who wrote literary novels as well. He had a great, long, terrific career, starting in the 1950s, publishing these novels in the Saturday Evening Post and elsewhere, and running right up to the 2000s when he died, unfortunately. But police procedural is a very, very popular genre. That's Inspector Morse, that's Endeavor, the young Inspector Morse. That's Harry Hole in the Joe Nesbo novels. It's very popular for obvious reasons. Second, we've got the private eye. This is somebody who's not really associated with the police department, but who has some professional training. The fun thing about the private eye is that he's not, or she's not, quite as constrained by the niceties of the legal system as the police are. So the private eye is frequently maybe breaking the rules a little bit, working on the wrong side of the law in order to achieve this greater good. That's, of course, Sam Spade. We're going to be seeing him in action tonight. Kinsey Millone of Sue Grafton's novels. Sue Grafton just died. She didn't quite make it to Z in her alphabet series. She got awfully close. Easy Rawlins in Walter Mosley's novels. And of course, Hercule Poirot and Sherlock Holmes are the archetypes for this kind of private eye. You also got women, V.I. Warshawski in Sarah Paretsky's novels, and one of my favorites is Anna Pigeon in the Nevada Bar novels. And Anna technically is a park ranger who ends up in different national parks solving mysteries, but she ends up on her own so much that she might as well be a private eye. Nevada Bar is terrific about sticking this woman out in horrendous conditions and giving her horrible adversaries and terrible challenges and watching her rise to the occasion. If you haven't discovered Nevada Bar, I would recommend her. Third, we got the amateur detective. This is my guy now. This is the kind of person I write about. And there's one reason for that. And the reason is that I'm lazy and I don't like to do research. I don't want to have to ride around with a policeman. I don't want to have to interview a private detective. I don't want to have to do that. I'd rather choose some ordinary schlub like me who finds himself or herself in a position of having to take on a task that the person has no training for whatsoever.
What did you call the subcategory?
Oh, this is amateur detective. At this point, I think it's time to bring Shakespeare into the conversation. We don't want to go too long without some Shakespeare. If you remember your 12th night, you remember that note that Malvolio gets declaring that some men are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. Amateur detectives can be of all sorts. Some are born great. If you take, say, Lord Peter Wimsey, in those Dorothy Sayers novels, he's not just born into the aristocracy, but he's born with a mind that can see exactly what's going on. He's got it all figured out. He's this gentleman detective. It's a popular sort, but I don't like to write about people like that. I'd rather write about the other two, people who achieve greatness or have greatness thrust upon them. People who might, in fact, at the beginning of the novel seem inferior to the reader, people the reader maybe snickering at a little bit for their shortcomings, but they rise to the occasion. That to me is more enjoyable than writing about somebody who already starts with, ahead of everybody else. If you think about Hitchcock movies, Roger Thornhill in North by Northwest is a good example of somebody who ends up having to essentially save himself because he's being pursued by everybody else. Or Richard Hannay and John Buchan's 39 Steps. The Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew were this kind of detective. They were just regular people who ended up solving a lot of crimes. Nick and Nora Charles in The Thin Man Nick Charles is a retired detective. Bill Hodges in Stephen King's Mr. Mercedes series is a retired detective, so maybe that he's the private eye, but they come back into the game because somebody asks them to. I was just telling my classmate and friend Jimmy Farrer that if he hadn't tried Stephen King's Mr. Mercedes, that's a straightforward detective novel. He has no supernatural elements at all in Mr. Mercedes. And I will say this, I don't think this is too much of a spoiler. It's a trilogy, it's part of a trilogy. By the time he gets to the end of the trilogy, he just can't help himself. He's got to get a little supernatural stuff in there. Stephen King is not for everybody. I'm a fan of Stephen King's. I think he's terrific. He's a former English teacher, and he publishes in The New Yorker, so he immediately gets my approval. All right, now, fourth, we really are in the same category as amateur detective, but because this genre is so popular, I'm going to treat it as a separate category. And that is, of course, the so-called cozy mystery. I heard lots of people last night say that they liked cozy mysteries. I find that term a little bit troublesome. It strikes me as vaguely condescending. It doesn't seem to bother the people who write them or the people who read them, so I may be the only person in the universe with this problem, but I don't know, calling something a cozy seems to isolate it from the rest of the world. I will say that cozy mysteries do not have to involve quaint villages or vicarages or cats, but they frequently do. They just about always feature a woman of a certain age as the detective. The archetype, of course, is Miss Marple. Dame Agatha gave us, as far as I could tell, and Taylor and Edward may know better, Miss Marple started it all, and then she became American and moved to Maine with Jessica Fletcher. But she's really the same character. A tea cozy is a quilted cloth that fits snugly over a teapot to keep the tea nice and warm. And I'm thinking that maybe that's how this genre got its name, that reading a cozy is like slipping into your favorite comforter. You know that you're going to be with some really genteel people for a little while, and you're not going to see a lot of violence on stage. It usually takes place off stage. You hear about it. Poisoning is often a frequently popular method of killing people because it doesn't involve drawing any blood. I mean, you could probably tell that I'm not really into cozies that much, but I think they deserve more respect than I've given them so far. It's really possible for you to find some really interesting, clever people in cozies, and what those writers are doing is something really good. I think that what they do when they choose that quaint little village is essentially to choose a closed environment. They are trying to isolate the number of possible suspects to this closed environment. You saw that with Louise Penny in The Beautiful Mystery, where she's in this monastery. It's a really, really limited number of people who can be suspects, and that's highly satisfying and hard to pull off. It's a really difficult task to do, but put somebody in a haunted house or an island cut off from the rest of the world, that's that's what the cozy writers like. They like to restrict the possibilities to a small world and then see what they can do with the people remaining. You can also get some really clever, interesting ideas. I've read several novels by Amanda Cross, which is the pseudonym of Carolyn Heilbrunn, who is a very distinguished professor of English, who was embarrassed to be writing mysteries. She tried to keep that a secret. One of her students finally outed her and she admitted it. But Kate Vansler, her protagonist, is a really interesting, smart, creative, witty character. And as Taylor intimated last night, I think we'll get later on into the kind of embarrassment or defensiveness people feel about mysteries and why that might happen. Carolyn Heilbrunn was a little embarrassed about being a mystery writer, and I don't think she needed to be. Alexander McCall Smith is a man who I think writes cozies. We can talk about this terminology, but the #1 ladies detective agency strikes me as being a cozy mystery. Whether Louise Penny is writing cozies or police procedurals is a matter of debate, but I think she's got a lot of the characteristics of the cozy, and she's very good. So finally, 5th category, the legal thriller. Now, I'm calling it that because that's what it's called out there in the world, but legal thrillers are not really thrillers. The protagonist is not in danger. The protagonist is a lawyer who's trying to discover the true perpetrator of the crime for which his or her client is accused. So the legal thriller is really a mystery, and it's called a thriller for whatever book-selling reasons there are out there. John Grisham and Lisa Scottolini have made very good livings writing legal thrillers. Sometimes the lawyer will hire a detective to help him. That's what Perry Mason did with Paul Drake. Sometimes the lawyer is just on his or her own. So at this point, we could reflect for a minute or two on why these books appeal to people. The answers are probably self-evident, but we might just consider that for a second. When I came to Lexington yesterday, I brought a crossword puzzle with me. I enjoy seeing if I can solve the Sunday crossword puzzle in the Washington Post. And I think that there's just something satisfying in spending some time with a likable character who's solving a puzzle. The puzzle solving is fun for us, and we enjoy that. Why is Citizen Kane considered one of the greatest movies ever made? I would argue that there are all kinds of reasons, of course. You've got a Shakespearean huge character at the center of the movie, but you've also got a mystery. The movie begins with a shot of Disney's Snow White castle transformed into Xanadu. Snow White came out 4 years before Citizen Kane, and the designer for Citizen Kane just borrowed the Disney castle look for Xanadu and those opening credits. That's really irrelevant, but there's no extra charge. No extra charge for that information. You move into a lighted window. You move inside the room where the window is lighted. You see a man dying. He drops a snow globe. The snow globe smashes, and he says, "Rosebud." And the rest of the movie is all about the attempt to find out Rosebud and who or what Rosebud was. And the great thing about the movie, one of the many great things about the movie, is that by the end, the patient viewer finds out the identity of Rosebud, but the people inside the story, the people who are looking for it, never do. They're frustrated. They quit a little too early. We stay with the movie just long enough to find out the identity of Rosebud. Just at the very, very end. It's just the perfect whodunit. It's just a perfect explanation. I admire that so much. All right, there's one reason. We would just like puzzles. We're wired to like puzzles. Another reason is that a lot of mysteries appear in the form of series, and we enjoy spending time with old friends. We get to know the protagonists in these series, and we get to know the quirky sidekick, and we get to know the eccentric family member, and we get to know the personal problems that this protagonist is going through as he or she gets this larger work of solving crimes. I think we're just drawn back to spending time with the familiar. That's why the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew did so well. They were old friends. When I finished that last Hardy Boys book when I was, I don't know, 11 or 12, I cried. I broke down and cried because I was having to say goodbye to these old friends of mine. We had been on lots and lots of adventures together. I didn't realize at the time that the Stratemeyer Syndicate was still cranking them out. The Franklin W. Dixon was just a pseudonym, and there would be many more Hardy Boy books coming along after the 43rd that I'd bought. 3, why do we like mysteries? Readers like to go backstage. They like to go behind the scenes. They like to see what's happening back there. When the lawyer and the judge says, "See me in my chambers," we like to go back to the chambers. We don't want to be left sitting there in the courtroom wondering what's going on. We like to go behind the police tape. We like to see what's happening back in that room. And mysteries take us there. We get to go places where ordinary citizens don't get to go. But honestly, I would say the main reason that people like mysteries, this is my 4th reason why people like mysteries, is that they present a comedic vision of the world. And when I talk about comedic, I'm not talking about funny, I'm talking about comedic in the sense that Dante wrote the Divine Comedy, the Commedia. They write works in which we get affirmation that it's all going to work out okay, that the universe is essentially benevolent, that order will be restored. They might start in disharmony and chaos, they end with order restored. And I think that is why we like these books. They're reassuring. We'd all like to believe that that's the way it's going to turn out. Anybody here read Tana French's In the Woods? Yes, okay, so we might want to talk about this later. That book drove me nuts. Drove me nuts. Still a spoiler, but not too much of a spoiler. The protagonist is a police detective who, as a child, walked into the woods with 2 of his friends and came out several hours later alone, bloody, wounded, and with amnesia. He couldn't remember what had happened, and his 2 friends disappeared, never to be seen again. So we go through this novel, and at the end, we still don't know what happened in the woods when he was a child, and that doesn't seem fair to me. Now, Tana French is highly acclaimed. She's hugely successful. She's a very, very good writer, but I'd really like to ask her why she did that. That's haunted me. Maybe that's a tribute to her work. But most of us, most of the time, like to wrap up mysteries with some kind of sense of completion, that all the questions have been answered by the end. Okay, so we've talked about the mystery genre. Let's talk about the relationship between mysteries and other kinds of literature. Why is it that so-called genre fiction, romance novels, mystery, science fiction, get dismissed as insubstantial? The more time I spend with books, the more I'm convinced that every great novel is at heart a mystery, some kind of mystery. Catch-22 is a mystery. Why is it that Yossarian is so haunted by that memory of Snowden in the back of the plane? Why does he keep returning to that? We find out at the very end. Tale of Two Cities is a mystery. It's a legal thriller. It's a whodunit. It's as much a work of crime fiction as anything else. Tom Jones, what about the mystery of his birth? That all comes to light at the end. Jane Eyre, that madwoman in the attic, there's a lot more going on. I don't want to just reduce these things to plot because the characters are so essential, but the distinction that people make between being a writer and being a mystery writer, I think, is really unfair. I got this from a friend of mine who writes literary novels. She kept saying, well, you're a mystery writer, and you're a mystery writer. And finally I said, Susan, I'm a writer, okay? I'm a writer. We write, I do the same thing you do. I come up with characters and plots and then dialogue, I have to tell stories. I'm a writer. So she, at least to my face, backed down on that distinction. Let's talk about how porous this boundary can be. Police procedural. Crime and Punishment. I was so glad to see that Crime and Punishment was listed in the notebook we got yesterday as a crime novel, because it is. Porfiry Petrovich, the detective in Crime and Punishment, is a model for Columbo. Columbo is Porfiry Petrovich. He's absent-minded. Oh, one more thing, let me ask you before I leave. He does that to Raskolnikov. And yes, there are more things going on in Crime and Punishment than just the decision about what Raskolnikov is going to do. But that policeman who's prodding him is so crucial to the story. Raskolnikov has to choose whether he's going to follow Svidrigailov into nihilism and pure self-interest, or whether he's going to follow Sonia into faith and altruism. And Porfiry Petrovich essentially says, I'm coming for you. You're going to get caught. You're going to see an end to all this. It's going to be better for you if you choose on your own. That policeman is really driving Raskolnikov to decide what kind of life he wants to live. Private Detective. I know Inspector Bucket in Bleak House, another book, by the way, that was listed in our notebooks yesterday. Inspector Bucket is technically a policeman, but he's privately hired by the Dedlock family to pursue Lady Dedlock, to get the heart of the mystery. I would say that he's a private eye. Sergeant Cuff in the Moonstone is a policeman, but he's doing a lot of independent work. William of Baskerville in The Name of the Rose. Maybe that is a mystery, maybe not, but Umberto Eco is exploring all sorts of interesting ideas in there. The Amateur Detective. This is so easy. Ever heard of a play called Hamlet? And you could say, well, no, Ted, Hamlet, according to your definition, is a thriller because we know that Claudius is the murderer. We're trying to see who's going to prevail here. But we don't really find out Claudius is the murderer until Act 3. There's no indication, except the testimony of a ghost, that Claudius is the killer. Hamlet is playing the amateur detective. He needs proof. He needs evidence. He's going to put on an antic disposition. He's going to put on a play to see if he can get proof of the guilt of his uncle. Or if you don't like Hamlet as an example, how about Oedipus Rex? Oedipus Rex is the weirdest detective story ever written because the detective himself doesn't even know that he's the killer. He finds out in the course of a very, very bad day. If you ever have a bad day, just remind yourself, it wasn't as bad as the day Oedipus had. Koozie mysteries. Longbourn is a charming village, and the 5 Bennet sisters make for a delightful family. But when handsome and rich Charles Bingley suddenly decamps for London, breaking the heart of his inamorata, Jane Bennet, Jane's sister Elizabeth needs to get to the bottom of this mystery. Was it Caroline Bingley, the scheming sister of Charles, responsible for his departure? Or was it the supercilious Mr. Darcy, who lives alone in the grand Gothic estate of Pemberley, shared only by his servants and his sister, whom he saved from a terrible fate? All right, that's really more like a romance than a mystery. But the point is that, and I was going to say this even before I found out we had Jane Austen fans in the audience, I think Pride and Prejudice is a perfect novel. I think it is a flawless, perfect novel. I don't think there's a single syllable that's out of place in Pride and Prejudice. And that perfect novel has a lot in common with so-called genre fiction. Legal thrillers. I would say that the best legal thriller ever written is To Kill a Mockingbird. And of course, there's a lot more that we remember about To Kill a Mockingbird than just the trial, but the trial is at the heart of the story. Good stories are going to do one of two things. They're either going to open a window into a world that we don't know, or they're going to hold up a mirror to us to get us to see ourselves in ways that we haven't considered before. I think the greatest books do both. Michael Chabon, who wrote one of the great novels of the 20th century, I just barely made it into the 20th century, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. If you haven't read that, you're in for a treat. Cavalier and Clay is set in the world of comic books. It's about escapism and the ways we escape from the troubles of our lives. But Michael Chabon has written in an essay called Thoughts on the Modern Short Story that entertainment gets a bad name. Entertainment gets a bad name. Think about that. If you go to the National Symphony at the Kennedy Center, or you go to the Impressionist exhibit at the National Gallery, and somebody asks you how it was, you probably wouldn't say, it was entertaining. If somebody says, how was Stacy Keach as King Lear? And you say, well, he was entertaining. You're damning him with faint praise. The implication is that it wasn't good enough. It was merely entertaining. But I would argue that every single word ever written started off as an effort to entertain. I tell my students all the time that poets don't write poetry to confuse us. They don't write cryptic codes that only those anointed by the bishops of English majoring can understand. Poets write poetry to share an experience. The same thing with novelists. I don't care if we're talking about Ulysses. Maybe we're talking about Finnegan's Wake. Maybe that one is a little too cryptic. But for the most part, people who write in order to connect with readers. They want to be enjoyed. And what is Henry James's Portrait of a Lady but a thriller? I can remember reading the last 30 pages of Portrait of a Lady with as much intensity as I read the last 30 pages of Stephen King's The Shining. I can remember the laundromat where I was sitting when I read Stephen King. I can remember the place in my home when I was reading the last 30 pages of Portrait of a Lady because I had to know what Isabel Archer was going to do. It's a thriller. Now, why is it that people tend to look down on these things? Taylor's going to get into that a little bit later, but maybe my story can shed a little bit of light on this. I was an English major here at WNL. Now we're getting into the answer to question 3, by the way. You know, why don't more people write novels, and why don't they write mystery novels? I was an English major, and as an English major, I was secretly terrified and terribly pretentious at the same time. Everybody else seemed to know more than I did, but that did not stop me from jumping right into a conversation and offering my opinion when I should have just been sitting back listening. I guess I was looking for some kind of reassurance that could hang with these smarter people. My first English professor here, James Boatwright, got the class reading the poetry of Hart Crane, and he would say, here's a poem by Hart Crane. It's so easy, he called it poster because it's so obvious. And I would nod and say, yes. I had no idea of what Hart Crane was saying in that poem. And in fact, I don't teach Hart Crane today because I don't want my students thinking that poetry has to be that cryptic. He also had us reading Wallace Stevens, and he would say things like, you notice the comic quality of the Emperor of Ice Cream? And I would say, I'm thinking, no, I don't. I don't. So one weekend, he asked us to write a paper about Sunday Morning, which is one of Stevens' most famous and most sardonic poems. I was sitting in this very building. It wasn't Huntley Hall back then. It was McCormick Library, and I was sitting in this very building, puzzling over this poem, baffled by this poem, utterly at sea with this poem, until one single line spoke to me. Does ripe fruit never fall? The woman in the poem is contemplating heaven and thinking about paradise. How heavenly would heaven be if it never changed? Does ripe fruit never fall? Is it everything always the same forever, for eternity in heaven? And suddenly, if I were British, I'd say the penny dropped. Suddenly, the cryptic pieces of this poem started to speak to each other. And I had what I didn't know the term at the time, but I had an epiphany. I went inside. I got inside the world of the poem, and suddenly time fell away. And I wasn't in McCormick Library anymore. I was in the world of this poem. And I started writing about it. And the process of writing about it brought more revelations. I can't stress this enough. You hear writers say this all the time. I write to find out what I think. That's really, really true. The process of writing taps into whatever's going on subconsciously with us. It pulls that up to the surface. We start to make connections that we just weren't aware of before, and that's the fun of writing. A lot of people say, oh, I'd love to be a writer. What they usually mean is, I would love to be a famous rich author. A famous rich author is somebody who has already written something, has gotten paid for it, and gotten well received, has a big following. Most people, when they say, I'd like to be a writer, don't mean, I'd like to labor alone for years on a project that haunts me and I never can't get right. That also is part of being a writer. This moment of clarity in McCormick Library, struggling with Sunday morning, was paradoxically really bad for me as a writer. It was bad because I stopped writing creatively. I'd written in high school, I'd written when I was in elementary school. I stopped doing that because I thought that I had to become smart before I could be a writer. I had to learn, I had to study and master all the great writers before I could become one, and believe me, I had every intention of becoming one. On my way to editing The New Yorker, I was going to win the Nobel Prize for Literature and several Pulitzers along the way. But before I could do that, I had to study the great writers. And when I graduated, I had this English major, but I was also really uneasy because I still didn't know what being a great writer was. So I did what I think a lot of people in that situation do. I postponed having to think about it and went to UVA for graduate school. I met Peter Taylor there, who was writing for my beloved New Yorker and was writing about exotic places like Memphis and Nashville. I'm from Roanoke, so that just didn't seem adequate to measure up to the glories of Nashville. I studied with Ann Beattie, who was also writing stories for the New Yorker, and she was only 4 years older than I was. She was 26 years old, and she was already a professor at UVA and published in the New Yorker. And that sort of got me thinking, I got to start doing this. I can't wait any longer. So I tried so hard. I would write these stories. I would write these stories about disaffected, privileged people at their vacation homes when I was in my John Cheever stage. I would write Southern Gothic when I was in my Faulkner stage. I would write strange, elliptical, bizarre stories during my Eudora Welty stage. And the problem with all these stories was that they were really boring. They didn't work because I wasn't inside. I didn't get inside the world of the story. I was dutifully producing these characters and these something like plots, and I just didn't feel anything. I wasn't feeling what the characters were supposed to be feeling. So I had my Prufrock Moment, and if you haven't read The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock recently, I'll tell you what a Prufrock Moment is. It's when you realize that you're not going to be what you thought you were going to be. I'm not Prince Hamlet, Prufrock says. I'm nowhere close to being Prince Hamlet. I realized I'm not going to be William Faulkner. I'm not going to be John Cheever. I'm not going to be Ann Beattie or Peter Taylor. I need to embrace my mediocrity. I need to accept the fact that I'm not going to be one of these writers. But I still wanted to be a writer. So I said, well, I'm having this interior dialogue with myself. What would you like to write? Would you like to, well, I'd like to write mysteries. That would be fun. I think it would be really fun to write a mystery because I know how to write mysteries. I've been reading mysteries all my life. I know all the conventions of mystery writing from reading all those Hardy Boys books. I know all the conventions of mystery writing from reading all those Ed McBain books on the train as I was traveling through Europe. I can write a mystery. So I talked to another English teacher who was also aspiring to be a novelist. And he said, here, read this book. This is absolutely true. This is what I did. I read a how-to book on how to write a novel. The writer of this book said, what you do is get a loose leaf notebook and you get 20 sheets of paper in it, and at the top of each page you write chapter 1, then chapter 2, chapter 3, you get to chapter 20, that's the end, that's the last one. At the end of chapter 7, something exciting needs to happen. At the end of chapter 14, something else exciting needs to happen. And by chapter 20, everything needs to be resolved. So I wrote out my outline, and then I started writing the book. And the most important thing I got out of that advice was, you have to write every day. You have to do this every single day. So I did. And I wrote a page a day. Every day, Christmas, New Year's, every day I wrote a page a day. At the end of the year, I had 365 pages. And I had reached the end of chapter 20. I had my novel. I'd written a novel. And I've got to say, it was a great success for me. As a work of fiction, it was disastrous. It was terrible. It was ludicrous. It was awful. I don't remember anything at all about this book except the title, which tells you everything you need to know about it. The title was, okay, seriously, this was the title, Murder in the Passive Voice. Now, I don't even need to go into all the grammatical or other problems with that title, but the benefit I got was that I could write a novel. I could do this. This is doable. Writing a novel is not like climbing a great mountain. It's like walking a great distance. I can walk a distance. You know, the Buddha says, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. You can do that. But you got to write every day. So now I'm going to try this again, only this time I'm going to really write a good book. And I'd been to England to study stage history of King Lear, and I'd had a fantastic flat in Hampstead. So I decided that I was going to set this in England with my protagonist living in a fabulous flat in Hampstead. And I called it Summer's Lease. John Mortimer's also written a book called Summer's Lease. We're both borrowing from the single sonnet of Shakespeare's that you all know, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? That's the one from which that title comes. And in Summer's Lease, I thought, I've really got something. So I named all the characters after my favorite professors here at WNL. There was a Cowling, there was an Evans. I didn't use Severn Duvall's last name. I had a character named Costain Parker, which are his two middle names. And I thought I was so clever by naming one character Ray George for my Shakespeare professor, George Ray. And the protagonist was, of course, named Thomas Boatwright for James Boatwright, my first professor here. So Thomas Boatwright is this, you don't need to know about Thomas Boatwright in Summer's Lease. He's involved in the theater. There's a lot of Shakespeare running through this novel. And I finished it, and I did the thing that a lot of amateur writers do. I took it to Kinko's, and I had it photocopied, and I gave copies of it to everybody I knew for Christmas. And waited for the acclaim to arrive. Don't do that. Not only did I gave one to my brother, one to my sister, one to my father, one to my mother. I didn't just have one family gift. I wanted everybody to have a copy of this masterpiece. So on Christmas, my father had other things to do. He didn't even start looking at it. My brother picked it up, read the first page, said, "Isn't Carolina playing Duke today in basketball?" My sister picked it up, read the first page, said, "Oh, I forgot to call Scotty." My mother picked it up. Now, your mom is surely going to hang with it. She read the first page and she said, "Oh, I forgot to put the broccoli on." So I did, again, what a lot of amateur writers do. I got furious with my family. I wasn't willing to accept that they were giving me really good feedback, which is that my first page didn't hook the reader. So I had to get over that. I had to get past that. I had to accept that reality. And I tried again. Over the summer of 1987, I studied in Princeton with the great John Fleming, one of the great medievalists of our time. We were studying the classical backgrounds to medieval literature. We spent a lot of time talking about passion and reason. And I really got into that. We were reading Othello with my classes at Woodbury that year. And Othello is, of course, all about the tension between passion and reason. We could talk about Othello a lot. I'll skip that part. But I decided that I was going to write a novel set in a boys' boarding school in Piedmont, Virginia, that explored this mighty theme of reason and passion. The first scene was set in Times Square. Now remember, this is 1980s, so Times Square is not what it is today with all the Disney stuff and the M&M store. When I was living in Princeton, my Aunt Jean and Uncle Charlie from Richmond came up to visit, and we were driving in from Princeton. We're driving down 42nd Street on our way to the theater district, and Aunt Jean, who had never been to New York before, looks around and says, "Look, Charlie, you can see 3 movies for $1. And that was the world where this novel was set. We usually 3 movies for $1. I'd never been in one of those theaters. Remember, I hate to do research. But I had seen Midnight Cowboy, so I figured, yeah, I'll just remember that scene, and none of my readers will have been in one of those theaters. Anyway, it's a very sordid scene in this theater, but that wasn't good enough. I had to come up with a killer first line because I was determined, I don't care what happens. Nobody is going to stop reading the first page because of basketball, Scotty, or broccoli. So the first line that I came up with, it took me hours to come up with this line. The first line was, he was honestly unaware that a murder would follow the end of the play. And I said to my imagined reader, I dare you to read that and put this book down. You might not make it to the end, but by God, you're going to make it to the end of the first chapter. At the end of the first chapter, this unnamed person heads off to Penn Station, catches the train, goes to Washington, drives to this boarding school in Central Virginia where he lives. And now I'm set. So, what happened? I'm about out of time, so I need to wrap this up. Got an agent. The agent sold it to Putnam. The people from Putnam published it. It was a main selection of the Mysterious Book Club. It was a finalist for the Edgar Award for Best First American Novel. My competition that year was Walter Mosley. He wrote his first E.G. Rawlins novel that year, Patricia Cornwell wrote her first K. Scarpetta novel that year. She's the one who won. And this would be the place where the movie ends, where, you know, I've made it. Obviously, I am not a household name. Obviously, Ms. Cornwell and Mr. Mosley's careers went in very different directions from mine. I got no regrets, though. I can tell you about that later, but I'm going to wrap it up with what Marilyn Stasio said. This was the one thing that gave me affirmation, and then I'm going to stop. I'm through. When she reviewed this book for the New York Times, she spent a few minutes bashing me for some mistakes that I made, and when it was re-released this April, I changed the thing that she was bashing me for. It's haunted me all that time. She wrote this: Mr. Blaine redeems himself with the endearing character of Thomas Boatwright. He's back, only this time he's a sophomore in high school. Mr. Blaine redeems himself with the endearing character of Thomas Boatwright, a sensitive 15-year-old student who struggles honorably with his conscience and at one point with the killer to arrive at an understanding of the moral points of Shakespeare's play. And the fact that some picky New York critic responded favorably to my character, to the character, made all the difference. I didn't have to be John Cheever or William Faulkner. I could just be a mystery writer and do my best. So that's it. Rob, 10 minutes, so we got some time for questions, challenges, objections.
What was the name of that novel?
The name of the novel was Passion Play.
Have you ever gone back to try to repair the earlier attempts and craft something out of that?
No, I'm glad to say that I don't feel any need to do that, especially with that first one. I don't think I even have a copy of it. I was looking for it the other day, and I think I just recycled it. I will say this, that I have finished another novel, and I think it's the best one yet, but it's taken me a while, and I've abandoned it several times. But every time I've abandoned it, the characters have come back and knocked on the back door and said, "Come on, let's go out for another ride. Let's go again." And I've gone back, and I think I figured it out last summer. I'm very confident that I got it, but I'm in the process of looking for an agent. Yes?
Do you still write every day?
No. When I'm working on a book, I do. When I'm working on something, I write every day, but I just have gotten too old to get up at 5:30 at Woodbury and write for 45 minutes or an hour before I go to class. Now I get up at 5:30 at Woodbury, and it takes me that long to get ready for class. So I wish I could say that I did, but the energy's flagged a little bit.
Is there anything that triggers an idea that you were just driving along somewhere, something happens?
Yeah, and sometimes you don't realize that until much later. You realize that something has stuck in your mind, some image, some encounter. I have a friend who went to seminary, and she told me the most interesting story. When she got to the seminary, she was living on a dormitory, and she said that on their dormitory at seminary, they were having a terrible problem with stealing. And I thought, that's so interesting and so counterintuitive. And I just sort of filed that away, but then I later used that in a short story, and it wasn't a mystery story, it was just a character of, with a chaplain in it who was not your stereotypical chaplain. So yeah, I never know what's going to do it. I think Faulkner said that if you're going to be a writer, you need experience, observation, and or imagination. He said any of those, 2 of the 3 will do you, but you need at least 2 of those 3, experience, imagination, or observation. Yes?
Your remarks are so humorous. Do you use humor in your writing?
I'd like to think so. Sometimes I'll laugh out loud, but of course that shows, how weird I am when I'm inside the world of this novel. But yeah, I try to. I think you gotta keep it light until it's not light. Yes.
I would say about novelists that they start a novel, they have the idea, and then their characters take over. And it's almost as if they are powerless to keep these characters from acting out and doing this. And I can't quite understand that.
Yeah.
Is that in fact your experience?
Absolutely. And that's actually a good thing. I think if you've read the comments in the back of The Sweetness in the Bottom of the Pie, Alan Bradley says that Flavia de Luce appeared when he was writing another book entirely, and suddenly his main character drives up and encounters this precocious 11-year-old girl, and she just took over. And he was smart enough to go with that and build a whole series around her. And I've got to admit, she's a hoot. She's hilarious, and I'm glad that he did that. But I can, the breakthrough story that I wrote back in the 1980s, the first time I ever became a professional writer and wrote a story that somebody bought and paid me money for, was a story I started with a guy at a keg party in Roanoke on the 4th of July. And he meets this chaplain I was talking about. He's uncharacteristic of school minister. And she says something obscene, and he's shocked by that. And the whole story ground to a halt. I thought I was just going to have to abandon it. But then I realized that the character wouldn't be shocked by that. The reader might be shocked by it, but this character wouldn't be shocked by that. So I realized I had to let the character behave the way the character wanted to behave. You have to let the character do what the character wants to do, even if it might not have been my reaction. I've got to let the character be the character. And once you learn how to do that, so let the character do something that you don't approve of. I don't like what this character is doing, but that's what the character wants to do. Then you're tapped into that place in your imagination where all the stories come from. Maybe that sounded like Shirley MacLaine. I don't know. I hope that made sense. Yes.
Has your family come around?
Nah. I mean, they're polite about it, but yeah, I'm wallpaper. They're fine, but it's just Ted.
He can't help it.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah.
You eat broccoli.
I'm very fond of broccoli. I like it. I've not resented broccoli. I don't blame broccoli for my own shortcomings.
Very good. Thank you very much.